If you would like to support the Likeville podcast, you can like us on iTunes. That's a good thing. You can share our podcasts with your friends and enemies even. And if you'd like to support us in a more material way, you can become a Patreon supporter of Likeville. All right. Welcome to the Likeville podcast. This is John Faithful Hamer. Today we're going to be talking with historian François Furstenberg about a couple of his books. But first of all, welcome, François.
Thank you.
I really enjoyed your book, When the United States Spoke French. Can you just talk a little bit about what the book is about and why you decided to write it?
Sure. So the book follows a group of 5 émigrés who fled France during the French Revolution and went to the United States. And these are all aristocratic émigrés. But they're liberal, so they don't follow the real profile of your classic émigrés who go to Turin or Coblence or whatever and want to overturn the revolution. On the contrary, these guys had been at the forefront of the French Revolution in its early years, and when the revolution became more radical, they were forced to flee or be imprisoned or potentially executed. So they left. Some of them went to England first, others, but they all ended up in the United States, where they lived in Philadelphia, in the capital, for a few years in the middle of the 1790s. And for me, what was interesting about these guys is that they're well-known figures in French history. I mean, these were people who helped to craft the first French Constitution, who led the French Revolution in its early stages, and all of a sudden they kind of popped up in Philadelphia in the middle of the 1790s.
So weird.
Yeah, I mean, they're sort of hanging out with people that I knew well. I'm a U.S. historian. And so these are people that I was familiar with to a certain extent from French history, but they just seem kind of like, what are they doing here? They sort of fell out of French history, and kind of landed in my neck of the woods without any apparent sort of reason. And here they are, and they're kind of paddling around with Hamilton and Jefferson and Benjamin Rush and whoever, people who I know pretty well. So I got intrigued in them, and that was a very early stage. I was kind of interested in them. And then that was when I was in the middle of my dissertation, and I was starting to think about ideas for what happens when this first research project is over. So I had that in the back of my head, and then when I finished the dissertation, I got a job here in Montreal at the University of Montreal, which is a kind of which is a French-speaking university. There's only 2 U.S. historians in the department, and so at that point I decided this will be a kind of interesting research project because it'll allow me to connect my own interests in U.S. history with broader dynamics with French history, with Atlantic history, and connect my own interests with those of colleagues in the department and with my students. So I thought it was a good way to integrate myself, if you want, into the intellectual life of Montreal. So that was the kind of personal dimension, and I think. I would say also that there were some genuine sort of intellectual trends that were happening at the time, which got also sort of furthered my interests. So this is when I moved to Montreal. It was 2003, and this was a period when Atlantic history was really flourishing. There was I mean, we both went to Hopkins, where Atlantic history had this long tradition. Wasn't really my field. I mean. When I was in graduate school, I was really a U.S. historian. I mean, my first project is about nationalism, right? So it was a U.S. focused topic, but I was reading in Atlantic history, and I knew about this thing. And then at Harvard, they set up this big research center to start, really launch the field of Atlantic history. And so it was a good time to kind of be thinking about U.S. history in broader dimensions, and not just Atlantic history, but really internationalizing U.S. history. There was the OAH was doing this big move to internationalize U.S. history. Bender was working on all the, he had these edited collections, and he later came out with this book on international. It's called I forget what the book is called, but it's on kind of U.S. history in broader global perspective. So there was a whole kind of field of research to anchor the perspective that I was interested in at this point. And so it helped set this into context and make it part of a larger conversation in that sense.
Yeah. I like a lot of things about the book, but one of them is that the way that you write. I mean, you write almost like a novelist, sort of like I can really feel sort of what it was like to be there at the time. And one of the things that strikes me and I guess I knew this sort of theoretically, but the way you write makes me understand it very kind of emotionally. How really, when you're in Philadelphia in the 1790s, this is, we have this tendency to imagine, we're seeing the great United States in its infancy, but at the time, nobody had any idea that the United States was going to become what it is. So really, these guys were off, like the equivalent of like hanging out in Tahiti or something, like in the middle of nowhere on the edges of the known world kind of thing, and hanging out in exile, from France and stuff like that. And so you get, and I love that one of the scenes early on in the book where you have, the guy going up in the hot air balloon, and you just describe what he's seeing as he's flying over Philadelphia. That was absolutely, that was like Tolstoy. That was amazing. But also one of the things that's very disturbing about your book, and I wanted to sort of get you to respond to this, because I didn't feel like I had a clear answer for it at the end, is that the book has a kind of Heart of Darkness feel to it, right? That you have these like the Kurtz type characters who start off very, very idealistic and very kind of inflamed by the Enlightenment ideals. And then by the end, you have, Noai, for instance, is like bringing over bloodhounds to hunt down slaves and eat them and destroy them, right? And is, taking these dogs out, and they're tearing a little kid to pieces, alive in front of a crowd that's cheering. And how does somebody go? Because this seems to me to be a theme in all of your writing, actually. All the way back to that article you wrote in the Journal of American History years ago, where you talked about how is it that these slaveholders in Virginia could toast the Haitian Revolution? Like, how does that make any sense whatsoever? And you explain how it actually does make sense. So maybe if you could explain the same sort of thing when it comes to these characters. How do they go from being in people who bring about the French Revolution to people who are bringing bloodhounds to Saint-Domingue?
I wish I had a good explanation for that. Okay, so, well, first of all, thank you for all the kind words about the book. That's kind of you to say. So, when it comes to this particular question, the Heart of Darkness is probably a good sort of analogy. I think one of the things that a lot of people have been sort of puzzling over for several generations now, I would say, is in the context of U.S. history, it's what you were referring to earlier. That is to say, the sort of apparent contradiction between slavery and freedom, right? The revolutionary movement is in the United States is this great expression of sort of these declarations of rights, of innate liberties, equality, all these kinds of grand principles, and yet they take place in the context of a slave society. And over the early years of the Republic's life, as the country becomes more democratic, which it does for white people, for white men, it becomes the most indeed radical democracy in the Western world at that point, so that people like Tocqueville are coming over in the 1830s to find out what's happening here and see what they think is going to be the future. And at the same time, this is a massively expanding slave republic, so that you have about 4 million slaves by the time of the Civil War. So how do these things go hand in hand? And that's been of interest to historians for a long time. In an even broader dimension, I guess, a broader scale, one can ask the similar questions about the Enlightenment itself. That is to say, how does, if one wants to use, you talked with David Bell the other, so, how does, do we even want to use that term in the singular, but let's use it for now. But how does this intellectual movement, or these sets of intellectual movements, however one wants to formulate it, which are, in fact, deep reflections on and pronouncements about the innate liberty and equality of humanity, how does this movement relate to the fact that at the very same time that Europeans are discussing these ideas and moving in these directions, and in a sense the American Revolution becomes the French Revolution, and which takes those same principles to a much greater extreme and much more universalistic ways. And yet that entire society, all of Europe, is basically is basically predicated on an economy that churns through the institution of Atlantic slavery. So in the Caribbean, in South America, and in North America, all of the kind of the crops that are
the big cash crops, the big money makers.
Yeah, that are the engines of the European economy. I mean, we're talking about sugar, coffee, indigo, cotton, tobacco. I mean, all these commodities, these are all produced by slave labor, and they all require the grueling oppression of Africans who are brought over and put into slavery across generations. And so here's the sort of economic foundations of the Enlightenment, and how do those things relate to each other? So this is another related to the one I was talking about earlier, but one of the major questions of kind of Western history, right? I mean, how do we understand this? And I think, a lot of...
I've assigned that particular article in the Journal of American History. I've assigned that to a couple of classes, and I had one very brilliant young student, Haitian girl. She's 17 years old, and she pointed out something really interesting. She said, wasn't one of the central ideas of the Enlightenment the idea that right is based on reason and that there's natural law and things like that? And she said, but actually the justification, if what Furstenberg is saying is right, the justification that they're using for why they deserve their freedom and other people don't is because they're willing to fight for it. And if you're not willing to fight for your freedom, you deserve your slavery, right? Which she said, isn't that just a reverting back to a kind of medieval might is right attitude, right? That it's just force is what decides what's correct or what's not. I mean, what do you think about that? Like that's.
I mean, I think she read the article and understood it pretty well. I mean, I would say that I'm not sure that I trace it back to even older lineages, going back to the ancient world, in which citizenship is based on a kind of martial virtue. So, and this is still the case today. We still have these ideas, right? I mean, there was a recent big hubbub, and I mean, I think it made it to the front pages of the New York Times, I think, about how this former veteran who'd fought in the U.S. Army had been deported. So there's still this idea, and there's a kind of fast track to citizenship if you serve in militia, in the army. So there's this very old idea, which, as I say, goes back to ancient Greece and ancient Rome, that an important bedrock of citizenship is your ability to serve, to fight, to serve in the armies. I mean, this is what creates the virtue as they understood it. It's one of the pillars of this ancient idea of virtue. So, and I think that continues on into the modern period and into our contemporary period, as I'm saying, where people do kind of understand that somehow military service is tied to citizenship, and that you need to somehow perform this kind of service. And it's one of the barriers to a more universalistic understanding of citizenship, right? So that this is part of the reason that it became such an issue for women to fight and to serve in combat forces. I mean, and this was a longstanding issue, but somehow this is a demonstration of citizenship. Now, the question is how far do we want to take that? Does that become a requirement of citizenship? Do we need military service to be? Well, we've decided that question in recent generations, obviously, that this is not a requirement of citizenship, but it nevertheless can be one way in which you can distinguish between different levels of citizenship, let's say, or levels of freedom. So that's a very old idea.
That was one way that they sort of rationalized it. Yeah, I also, we were discussing a couple of weeks ago on the podcast Neil Ferguson's new book, The Square and the Tower, which it's very funny because I read his book, and then right after his book I reread your book, right, When the United States Spoke French, and they work very, very nicely together. I mean, because he talks a lot about the role of networks and hierarchies throughout history and in kind of making movements. And he talks about the American Revolution, the French Revolution, many other things, and the importance of these rich kind of networks in the Atlantic world to making various things happen. He actually cites, you're in the footnotes of his book at one point, but to what extent do you think the networks that were present at the time were the kind of the motive force behind things like the Haitian Revolution, the French Revolution, the American Revolution? Like, to what extent are they kind of cross-pollinating each other, or to what extent are they just kind of coming out of the culture that's there without much contact with the outside world?
Well, I think there's clearly a lot of interrelationship between these movements. I mean, there's no doubt. Now, what metaphor we want to use to talk about that is a question. It's an interesting question, and that language changes over time. I mean, the network. We're in the mode of the network, right? This is the age of the social network. This has become one of the master metaphors for understanding our world today, and we use that now to understand the past as well. So we see social networks everywhere. I suspect, if I had to predict, that in 20 or 30 years, if anyone ever picks up my book off some dusty shelf and looks at it, it'll seem really dated, right? Somebody will be able to say, "Wow, that was really a product of the early 21st century." This kind of Facebook age. With all my sort of my chart of networks. I mean, I really dove into it. I think without thinking too much about how that metaphor works. I mean, it seemed when I first started thinking about it, it seemed sort of fresh. People were talking about, networks here, networks there. Now everybody's talking about it, and it doesn't seem nearly as fresh. But it has become one of the ways of understanding. There's other metaphors for thinking about this. One of them is contagion. I mean, this is a way that people talked about it back in the 18th century, the kind of contagion of liberty. So that you have, I mean, they didn't have an idea of germ theory in a sense, right? But you can think about it that way. There's a kind of virus that sort of infects one body politic and then moves across and kind of spreads in that way. There's the chain of revolutions. I mean, that's a very powerful metaphor as well. So that one link leads to another, and this has a more kind of linear sense in it, linear kind of implications, right? So that you need the American Revolution to understand the French Revolution, and you need the French Revolution to understand the Haitian Revolution. And so there are all kinds of different. There was this idea of one great revolution, which has multiple movements within it. So there are lots of ways of kind of thinking about these things, but I think it would be hard to argue that they're not connected in some way. I think that would be a hard claim to make. They're obviously, each movement is very different and has its own kind of indigenous causes and which shapes the context, which shapes the evolution of each of these movements. But they're all deeply interconnected with one another.
Yeah, there's I don't know if you've checked out that new book by Charles Mann. He's got a couple of them, but not The Wizard and the Prophet. The one just before that, it was 1493, I think it was. But in there, he has this very wacky theory that I've never heard before, but I was wondering what you thought of it. He says that if you look at the Mason-Dixon line, roughly, before Europeans ever got to the Americas, what you find is that north of the Mason-Dixon line, the native peoples of the northeast of North America did not have slavery. They had, and in fact, they had sort of federations, and they had systems that look roughly like what we would think of as being democracy, something like democracy. And below the Mason-Dixon line, long before Europeans showed up, the native people there had slavery, and they had very hierarchical systems. And he goes sort of all over the Americas, and he advances this very strong thesis that a lot of the things that emerged in the European settlements of especially North America, but also South America and Central America, were actually there already. That some of those divisions, and he says that this probably has something to do with climate and soil and what kind of things you can grow there, what kinds of how thickly you can be settled, right? How you're going to. It's very crazy idea, but the idea that what you saw with North and South and emerging, where some of these kind of colonies no longer have slavery or have it very little. What do you think about that? I mean, that's
all right. So I haven't read the book.
Okay,
it sounds super interesting. I mean, I think that there's little doubt that sort of environment, landscape, agriculture, all these things shape human societies in important ways. I'm gonna express some skepticism from your description. I mean, I would find it surprising, given what I know, which isn't a whole lot, but I would find it surprising if slavery didn't exist among Amerindian societies, before north of what's now the Mason-Dixon line. I don't think that's right, but maybe it is. And it all sounds a little too deterministic for my taste. Yeah. I mean, historians hate determinism, so we're kind of professionally trained to avoid anything that kind of smacks of it. But I mean, I don't think that there's quite such a linear relationship between agriculture and the kinds of societies, so that tobacco somehow is an inherently slave crop. I mean, there are reasons why when Virginians are producing tobacco, slavery is more profitable than it is in production of wheat, for instance. But I would find that a different claim. I mean, when Native Americans are growing tobacco, they're not doing it for the same reasons that Europeans are. I mean, that Virginians are. So, and then you going down, there is clearly something correct about saying that there are certain areas that can support greater population density, so that would create different kinds of societies. Yes, that's true. Does that naturally incline towards slave society? I don't know. I mean, I find it so, and even if you, I mean, if you go to sort of parts of history that I know a little better, I mean, you could sort of reverse the claim and say the United States was pretty close to abolishing slavery in Virginia and Maryland in the 1820s and 30s. I mean, that could have happened, in which case we wouldn't see the Mason-Dixon line. I mean, that was pretty close to happening. It was right on the edge, and that, in which case, for us, the Mason-Dixon line would have wouldn't be very meaningful. We would have found some other line between, let's say, North Carolina or maybe even a little further south. And then that would be the line, and then, maybe Mann would be writing about how that's really the region that distinguishes. So I'm just going to be a little
skeptical. That actually folds in very nicely with another question I wanted to ask you. I remember Ron Walters in seminars, one of the things he would ask us to do is after we had done a bunch of research on a particular issue, he would say, ask us the what if question. He said, you know enough about this topic now that you should be able to identify a couple of what if scenarios, right? So wondering, in your research into that whole period, can you imagine a couple of sort of what ifs, like things that could have gone differently, Lenin not making it to the Finland station type moments? Like, can you imagine some moments where if that had gone differently, it would have vastly changed the course of the history of one of these various trajectories?
Yes.
Okay.
Many, and it's one of the
hear it.
It's one of the fun. This is to
Ron. If you're listening, you'll be happy with this.
It's one of the great. So I fully endorse Ron's. Principle here that it's important to kind of imagine, and it's it's certainly fun. This is usually a thing that historians do, sort of like at the late night at a conference after a couple drinks, right?
Yeah,
you start playing this stuff
quite
out.
A few drinks.
This can turn into a total parlor game, right? Yeah. But it's an important intellectual exercise.
Very much.
It's an important intellectual exercise because it does reinforce the contingency of these things. It's easy to look back on the past and say because it happened this way, it had to happen this way, and it's true that much of our job is to kind of explain why it happened this way, right? Which is easy to turn into this is the only way it could have happened, but in fact it's not the only way that it could have happened. There's so many sort of forks in the road where and each one had to lead to the place that we ended up, and and part of our job is to understand those forks, to see them in that way. So the one that jumps immediately to mind, which I play out a little bit in the book, is. So you talked a little bit about the Haitian Revolution, and we'll talk more about it, I'm sure. But there's a moment. So over the course of the 1790s, the former slaves in Haiti fight their way. They fight against the French Republic. They fight against the British Empire. They fight against the Spanish Empire. The three great powers of the age, and they succeed in gaining their autonomy. Now, they do this. They do this once Toussaint sort of returns and he allies with the French government after 1794 when the French abolished slavery in their colonies, largely as a response to what's going on in Saint-Domingue. The Haitian Revolution is taking place in the name of the French Republic. So when Napoleon comes to power late in the 1790s, he was quite unhappy with this state of affairs, and for whatever reason, and there's lots of speculation about this, he decided that he needed to sort of return to the status quo ante in Saint-Domingue, to put all the freed slaves back into slavery, to restart the sugar economy in that way. Although Toussaint had been working to restart the sugar economy outside of formal slavery, so Napoleon sent a vast army into Saint-Domingue to try to re-enslave the formerly enslaved people of Saint-Domingue. He sent them in 1802. This is the Leclerc expedition that I talk about, and it was a catastrophic failure for Napoleon. And there's this great line that I spent many hours trying to find because I had seen it referenced in a few places, but I couldn't dig it up myself. Where Napoleon, when he's in exile in St. Helena, later is saying, he has, a set of published memoirs that are usually spoken to some of his generals. And he says that was one of the greatest mistakes of his life, which is a great, that's a great line, right? Like, here's
From a guy who's made some pretty epic mistakes.
He made some pretty epic mistakes, right? You would think that, I don't know, the invasion of Russia, for instance, might be up there.
Whoops.
But here it is, right on par with that. So that's pretty interesting. So what's an alternative scenario to what Napoleon did? Well, an alternative scenario is that he could have recognized Toussaint as the de facto leader of Saint-Domingue within the broader French Empire as a kind of ally. And Toussaint, in fact, wasn't repudiating his alliance to France. He wasn't saying we're not French, we're completely independent. No, he was saying that we want to sort of run our country, our island in our own way. So he wanted more autonomy, which is what he had. And there is a model for this earlier in the 1790s. The French Republic had been allying with freed slaves in Guadeloupe, and of course in Saint-Domingue itself, and gaining great victories over the British and the Spanish. So Napoleon could have done that. He could have allied with Toussaint, and he could have just understood that as part of the French Empire. And Napoleon's one of his major objectives in holding on to Saint-Domingue was to, not his objective, but one of the subordinate objectives of having Saint-Domingue was to re-expand the French Empire into North America. So, part of the same mission that was going to Saint-Domingue in order to re-enslave the slaves was going to go back, the former slaves, was to go on through the Gulf of Mexico into Louisiana and make Louisiana French. They had just secured a French Louisiana, the retrocession of Louisiana from the Spanish. That was all part of Napoleon's master plan. So if instead of trying to fight Toussaint and re-enslave the now freed people of Saint-Domingue, what if he'd allied with Toussaint, put together a biracial force that would have gone on as they had been doing in the Caribbean and the shipping in the 1790s? What if they had gone on to Louisiana to hold Louisiana with this force? There would have been tens of thousands of French troops who hadn't died in Saint-Domingue, along with Toussaint's forces who had been victorious over the British and the Spanish. This would have been a pretty powerful army to hold.
We could
New
all
Orleans.
be speaking French in North America if that happened.
We could.
No, think about it. The British, right? The Americans rise up. They have a revolution against the British, and pretty soon afterwards, they kiss and make up, and they have regular relations with each other, and together they manage to expand the English-speaking world quite dramatically, right, all over the place. Imagine if instead of doing that, they kept fighting against the Americans and sort of weakening each other constantly in the process, meanwhile strengthening the hand of their opponents. They could very easily have weakened each other so much that perhaps the French Empire the French-speaking world would be in the same situation.
Yeah, Louisiana was still, large parts of the Mississippi Valley had French-speaking populations that were still, Métis and even former French soldiers who were in these trading posts across the Mississippi Valley. A lot of Native American nations in that region held on to their former alliance with France. And now if you imagine a French army moving into that region, that would have been very difficult to dislodge. And you can imagine pieces of the Trans-Appalachian West, like Tennessee or Kentucky, detaching from the United States and allying with this French Republic in the Southwest. And then, it's hard to imagine at that point how the United States would have expanded into the Southwest, into Mississippi, Alabama, into this entire Black Belt. So, that's the site that will become the future slave republic of the United States, slave empire of the United States. So, and that might never have happened, so how would the United, so you can play this out. It would have terribly weakened the institution of slavery in the United States if it hadn't been able to expand. And it's hard to imagine slavery continuing and growing in the Chesapeake region without that outlet in the Deep South. Slavery might have withered away in the United States. Maybe no Civil War. Now, of course, we're really in the realm of fantasy. Most likely, I think the most immediate outcome of had Napoleon done that with Toussaint would have been an alliance between the United States and Great Britain. Jefferson would have tossed out his former French sympathies. He said this quite clearly. I mean, who knows how much he was posturing diplomatically, but I suspect there would have been a kind of joint mission with the British and the Americans to descend the Mississippi and try to dislodge the French. I mean, who knows what would have happened? So maybe it wouldn't have succeeded. But it's fascinating to kind of think about, and also just to think about the ways in which even this expansion of slavery in the United States, which is one of the great stories of American history. I mean, it's one of the central themes of the 19th century in the United States, that even that might not have taken place if things had played out a little differently in the late 1790s and early 1800s.
So, I mean, I can imagine the most obvious explanation for why they didn't take that route, but it seems that it's probably racism, right? That they wouldn't want to sort of ally themselves with the Haitians. But do you think that's actually the reason, or is there some other?
I think racism was a huge factor in this. I think Napoleon. We could delve or not into his psychology. I mean, it's hard to know, of course, but Napoleon seems to have really detested the idea of a Toussaint. He was sort of the Black Napoleon, people referred to him. So he seems to have resented that, detested the very idea that Black people could make these claims on freedom. His wife was from the former plantation owning class of French people, so she may have had an influence. There's speculation about that, and then there are economic motivations as well. I mean, there's the France was very reliant on its Caribbean commodities, its Caribbean islands, the sugar islands. I mean, if we go back in time a little bit to the end of the 7 Years' War, we can recall that there was negotiations at the end of the 7 Years' War between Britain and France, whether Britain was going to return Canada, all of Canada, back to France, or Guadeloupe. And France ended up going with Guadeloupe. It was that lucrative, right? One small island was more economically powerful than the entire.
I've seen the numbers and they just blow my mind. Like, it was just an economic powerhouse.
And so France, especially when it's fighting these wars with Great Britain and with much of Europe, I mean, it needed that economic motor. So they wanted to get the sugar economy back on track and running. And it's as they understood it, and there's good reason for them to have understood it that way. Getting the sugar economy running is completely incompatible with abolition. So that was another major reason for wanting to maintain slavery in the Caribbean as the French side. But racism is clearly there. I mean, it's very hard for people, and it continues to be very hard throughout the 19th century and long into the 20th century. In fact, I mean, this is part of the reason that the last generation or two has seen a lot of interest in the Haitian Revolution, is because it's very hard for whites to imagine Black people in general and former slaves in particular as human actors capable of acting politically in the same way that white people do. So people have very little difficulty understanding the American Revolution as a movement for human freedom or something like that, as a political act. They have very little difficulty understanding the French Revolution in those ways, although there's contest over that. I mean, in terms of the ways we understand the Jacobins in the French Revolution and the demonization of the Jacobins. But with the Haitian Revolution, it's very hard for people to even understand that as a revolution. It's hard for people to understand that for white people to understand it as a political movement, as a universal movement for freedom. So it's just very hard for white people to get their heads around in Napoleon's time, never mind our own, around this idea that this was a movement on par with, and in many ways even greater than, the French or the American Revolution.
Oh, I remember when I was in undergrad going to Carolyn Fick's classes, and she's written a lot on the Haitian Revolution, and the responses people would say in class were, I mean, absolutely, they were creepy. But another what if scenario that I wanted to ask you about, because I know you've written a great deal about Washington, and another one of your lovely books, In the Name of the Father, and you've written about but right now, in the age of Trump, we're sort of talking a lot about tyranny and about limits on executive power and on having, all these things kind of trace back to the founding of the American Revolution. A lot of people talk about how if you did not have a George Washington when you did, and the kind of person, all the mythology, laying down the sword in front of Congress and giving up and deciding not to take over, and right. What do you think the United States might, another one of these what if scenarios, what do you think the United States would have become, or what would have become of the American Revolution if you didn't have a Washington? Would it have just gone the way of the French Revolution? You know, have a kind of a strong man taking over. I mean, what's your guess?
Well, I like the early framing of that because I think it's I never thought about it this way, but why not? I think it's fair to blame George Washington for Donald Trump. I think, yeah, I mean, it's in many ways the unlikeliest scenario of all is the one that took place, right? That the American Revolution would lead to some kind of stable republic / democracy. I mean, I think that was the especially on the scale in which it happened, on this sort of almost continent-wide scale. That was almost unimaginable at the time, and even those who were putting it into place thought that this was going to be a very difficult task to accomplish. So yes, I mean it was very unlikely. There's all kinds of ways of understanding that playing itself out differently. The most common model that people had in their minds at that point was of a kind of Caesar, right? That the republic fights its enemies, but then and emerges victorious, but then falls into some kind of despotism, because that seemed to be the ways that republics evolved. There was a kind of historical, circular historical understanding that you have a republic which is very fraught and contingent and is always fighting to maintain itself, and eventually it falls into despotism, and then eventually into some kind of
wheel. Yeah.
Exactly.
So, yeah.
Or maybe anarchy, which results in the rise of a despot,
yeah.
and then the destruction of liberties. So this was the kind of almost the inevitable historical scenario, and the challenge was how to freeze it in this moment of Republican virtue, in this moment of Republican time, and one of the major fears. I mean, this is one of the major reasons that people are worried about centralized executive power. The way they understood it, King George had been seeking to expand his powers at the expense of Republican liberties, parliamentary rights, and rights of self-government, local self-government, and the kind of central power in London had been trying to crush freedom in the colonies. So this was a recurrent danger as they understood it, and they worried about the new executive power that might rise. And so for that reason, it was such a incredibly symbolic act when Washington gave up his commission at the end of the American Revolution, and sort of metaphorically beat his sword into a plowshare. I mean, this was an incredible moment. And there's a story, it may be apocryphal, I don't know, but I've quoted it, I mean, as a possibly apocryphal story. But there's a story that when King George first heard the news that Washington had resigned his commission at the end of the Revolution, he said, if he does that, he'll be the greatest person in the world, or something like that. And it's a great line, right? It's a great story because there's almost a sense of jealousy. I mean, here he is, the king, who still exerted great power back in the 18th century in terms of governance. Here's the king of the most powerful empire in the world, who is expressing some level of jealousy against this upstart revolutionary. And Washington kind of figured it out that it's really by giving up power that you can achieve the greatest fame and, in a sense, power, different kind of power, right?
I mean, he was just turned into this
he's the Republican
legend.
God, absolutely, and he's used as this incredibly powerful symbol to So and he understood this the power of that symbolism, and he understood, and it's really an astonishing kind of lesson. I mean, when you look back over the centuries since then, there are very few people who've done that. I mean, the temptation for people who are in power is to hang on to power. And to I mean, you just see it. We've seen it very recently with constitutions that get kind of amended so that people stay in power on some quasi-permanent way. This is still happening today, right? So never mind 200 and however many 40 years ago. This was a very impressive thing to have understood for Washington. And so, I mean, what you're referring to, right, is that it's because people trust in his ability to give up power, because he did that at the end of the Revolution. People, one of the more expected outcomes of the revolution might have been that Washington sees this Congress, which is not paying salaries, which is really dysfunctional, and which is has outstanding debts, and there's all kinds of grievances, legitimate grievances against Congress, and he could have with probable ease, sort of rallied the army to march on Philadelphia and to proclaim himself some kind of king or some kind of authority, emperor, whatever, and and reigned for the rest of his life. I mean, that was certainly understood as the most likely and dangerous scenario for the American Republic. So Washington had specifically refused to do that by giving up power at the end of the Revolution, and it was this incredible act that he resigned his commission as commander-in-chief. And so that was why people trusted him. That was why they venerated him after the Revolution. And when he returned to the Constitutional Convention, which he did with great hesitation, and presided over it, there's this kind of line by someone, I forget who, maybe someone in the Constitutional Convention, that whenever they began discussing the executive in the Constitution and the grant of really quite extensive powers to the executive under the Constitution, they would look up at Washington and imagine him as the president, and that was part of the reason they were willing to do that. So I think, and I think there's a great deal of reason to think that that's right. I mean, that it was the trust that people had in Washington that made this new executive, that gave authority to this new executive, and that made people willing to trust the new executive with all those powers that it was granted.
Yeah, well, John Diggins says that basically, you're almost tempted to believe in some idea of God favoring the United States because they've been so unbelievably lucky with leaders on numerous occasions where they just happen to get a Washington at the right time, or a Lincoln at the right time, or a Roosevelt at the right time, when they could have, it didn't need to go that way. They could have got the kind of leaders that Germany has got or France has got that were a disaster. And they've just been very lucky in that respect. Another thing you talk about, which wanted to get you to expand upon, is the contrast between Washington's personal and political attitudes towards slavery and Jefferson's sort of personal and political. Right? So, how did they differ on the subject of slavery? Those two.
It's an interesting contrast. I think both of them are slave owners. Both of them have hundreds of slaves under their control, at least, if not direct ownership. And but they have quite different styles of slaveholding and quite different attitudes towards race, insofar as we can understand those. So Washington was a demanding slave owner, but his views seem to have changed over the course of his life. I mean, in his early years, he seems to have understood slavery as part of just the natural order of things, and it was a largely unproblematic institution. So he writes very casually about sending a slave to the Caribbean to be traded for barrels of I forget what, rum or something like that. For him, it's just sort of one good for another. I mean, he doesn't express any kind of sensitivity or remorse about that, or any trace of guilt. And that was a way many slaveholders talked about slavery in the middle of the 18th century. During the course of the Revolution, he began to rethink his views on slavery, whether that was out of a sense of morality or out of a sense of sort of public perception that this looks bad.
Want to be a little more consistent, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, many Europeans were observing, not just Europeans, many slaves in the United States and blacks in the United States were observing and making claims about the hypocrisy of these slave owners who were crying out for liberty.
Mm-hmm. That famous line, yeah, right.
Famous line, yeah. And so these Americans, like Washington, are very sensitive to how Europeans perceive them, to how liberal Europeans perceive them. I mean, they understand themselves as living in the kind of backwater of European empires, of European civilization, and they're very keen to establish themselves and make themselves understood as not just civilized, but in fact at the kind of cutting edge of worldwide sort of liberty, movement for liberty. So slave holding becomes a real embarrassment for them. But it's certainly possible. I mean, there are many people who genuinely do begin to rethink the morality of slavery as a real problem and as a real concern, and in line with intellectual and religious and other kinds of pressure. So there are all kinds of reasons for Washington to begin changing his views about the propriety of being a slave owner. But this happens gradually. I mean, Washington is a very conservative person, I think, temperamentally. So he began over time to express greater reluctance about selling slaves, and he swears at one point during or slightly after the Revolution that he'll never again sell a slave. But this creates a problem for him because as he begins shifting his farms out of tobacco and into wheat, he's one of the earliest to see that tobacco has a limited future in the Chesapeake region, and that wheat is the wave of the future. So he begins shifting towards wheat, but wheat demands far less labor than tobacco does. So he ends up with a real surplus of labor, which he begins wrestling with what to do. So there are practical problems for him too. He's sworn not to sell slaves, which is the most obvious solution, which most people would do. But he now has hundreds of slaves who are not put to work in the way that he thinks they should be. So he begins searching for answers. And this is, ultimately, and also it's very significant that he doesn't have any heirs himself. His wife does, but she and she owns I think a greater number of slaves on the Washington's plantations than he does, because they were inherited from her former husband. So Washington doesn't have any heirs to worry about. So when he dies, he has this will which proclaims freedom for the slaves under his control. So his life ends with a pronouncement of abolition. It's a very complicated one, and we can go into the details if you want. But nonetheless, it's a statement. It's an important statement, a very public statement, that this is how he sees the future of the republic in some sense, that abolition needs to be part of that future. Jefferson, by contrast, doesn't do that. And there's different logistical and practical reasons that he doesn't. I mean, his very extensive writings on slavery are fraught with contradiction and tension. With Washington, it's tempting to see this very sort of linear progression towards a kind of eventual understanding that abolition is the future. I think it's more complicated than that, actually. But with Jefferson, there's no linear progression. I mean, there's back and forth. Some of his most radical pronouncements happen early in the 1780s in the context of his conversations in France and Paris. But those are also some of his most racist pronouncements.
And I remember Gore Vidal once said about Jefferson. He said, "If you want to understand what America is all about, don't look at Washington or Lincoln or look at Jefferson, this guy who talks an incredibly good game and is very idealistic in his rhetoric, but in his personal life, complete hypocrite. Like, does not, live up to any of this stuff, but anyway."
Yeah, no, I mean, he's a mess. He goes all over the place. He says one thing and then the other and then the other. And, and who knows what he really thinks or believes. It's that's a kind of, I think, impossible question. I mean, you can get just lost in the kind of rabbit hole of the Jefferson's mind. And, of course, all of this has been made even more flagrant in recent years with the kind of widely now recognized acceptance of the fact that Jefferson had a long-term affair or liaison, or however one wants to frame that, with Sally Hemings, and that he was the father of enslaved children, who individually ended up being freed, but very quietly. And then when he died, again, the context is different. His plantation he's greatly indebted, but nevertheless, members of his children's family are sold off to pay off his debts. And so it's a much more painful story. If you take each of them as kind of metaphors for the nation, Washington's is a much more comforting metaphor, right? We have this gradual movement towards abolition, and we know which direction it's moving towards. Jefferson's is a much more fraught and painful one. When it comes to their racial views, Washington doesn't seem to have had as much overt racism as Jefferson did. He didn't seem to have much trouble accepting that slaves could fight he was opposed to it at first, but not, I don't think, maybe it was on racist grounds, but I think the idea of slaves fighting in the army, of black people fighting in the army, wasn't one that he saw as paradoxical or impossible. He was a very exacting and demanding owner of slaves. He demanded a great deal of them in the ways that maybe that comes from his role as general. But he also didn't seem to have great agony or fears about the Haitian Revolution. He talked about it quite matter-of-factly, and I suspect that the idea of slaves rebelling and fighting for their freedom wasn't one that he found shocking or strange. And he doesn't seem to have spent a lot of time having bad dreams about it. Jefferson, on the other hand, clearly did. I mean, he said he did.
Oh, yeah.
He talked about the cannibals of the terrible republic and all these kinds of things. He's in very, very racist language, and for him, it was a much more complicated problem in a sense. That slaves could fight for their freedom, and he couldn't really think about it in those terms. For him, this was just a kind of barbaric outpouring of violence, a kind of senseless madness and violence, and not a political act. And Jefferson seems to have spent nights, in terror at this prospect, and in terror that his own slaves would rise up and that American slaves would rise up. So they have very different ways of understanding slavery, of understanding race. Jefferson makes many more sort of flagrantly racist statements, which again makes his long-term affair with Sally Hemings harder to understand in a sense, right?
Yeah, I really don't get it. But another question I wanted to ask you is how do you see their views differing on the question of kind of the indigenous people of the Americas, like sort of Indians or natives, however you want to describe it? Because they also seem to have very different views of them. And what do you think's going on there?
Well, Washington grew up as a surveyor, and he had more contact, I think, with Native Americans in his childhood, and actually as general as well. I mean, as first as colonel and then later as general. He was fairly adept in the norms of Native American diplomacy. If not adept, he was at least conversant with those norms. I mean, Jefferson, I think, had less direct contact. He understood. He was interested in Native American society more, almost as a scientific, like a kind of early anthropological kind of interest, I guess. I mean, certainly he practiced Native American diplomacy when he was Secretary of State and president, but nonetheless, I think it had a different valence for him. And he had this kind of conception of Native American society as something that he had a more romantic kind of Rousseauian conception of Native Americans as this kind of noble race of noble savages who were destined to disappear in the kind of progress of civilization. It's a kind of soft racism, if you want to think about it that way. In that sense, there's something at once generous about it, but at once so passive that there's a kind of willing acceptance of expropriation and genocide, just as a kind of natural order of things. Whereas Washington, I don't know that he thought as deeply about the future of Native American societies. He probably wouldn't have differed on some conception of their ultimate fate. I think that I've seen less a kind of romantic expression of regret over the disappearance of the noble savage in his writings. Although one would want to look a little more carefully, perhaps, than I have.
Yeah, because I've never seen any. I mean, maybe it's there, but I've never seen any implication of like him being into the idea of manifest destiny or anything like that. That seems very much, and Jefferson very much has this idea. We have to move across the continent, and these people are in our way, so they can either assimilate or die. Basically, that's.
Yeah, I mean, there's one of the interesting things I think about this period is that the politics are more complicated. The good guys are good on some issues, and the bad guys are bad on some issues, but the bad guys are sometimes good on other issues, right? I mean, so I don't know what. I mean, the bad guy, good guy thing doesn't. One's politics today don't map out very well on one's politics in the past. So,
I mean, even if you go back 100 years from the present day, I mean, most people who we would consider to be right-thinking, left-wing types, right, progressive types, they were big proponents of eugenics and all sorts of crazy things.
Exactly.
Right?
So, and that's the case in the early republic. So, Jefferson, who is the really great spokesman of democracy, isn't he? I mean, and we have his quotes all over the place, I mean, and he leaves great quotes, doesn't he? He writes really beautifully and deeply about innate rights, about equality, all kinds of things. But he is also much more racist than Washington, for instance, or Hamilton, who's become our hero. But in the early 1790s, I mean in the 1790s and early 1800s, this isn't much of a paradox. If you are for equality for whites, you probably are more racist because one of the things that whites are fighting for is the right to be slave owners or the right to take Native American land. So there's continual conflict on the frontier between poor whites who've pushed out and often squatted on public lands or on Native American lands without any title to that, without any right to that, in violation of treaties between the United States and Native peoples. And so how does the government respond to that, or how do elites in the East respond to that? Well, Republicans tend to be more sympathetic towards the rights of squatters and settlers than Federalists are. Federalists are often quite precisely because they have a greater sense of hierarchy and a greater elitism, they're much more likely to view those whites who are on the frontier as savages themselves, as criminals, as bandits. And Washington has many quotations to that effect, and that's the way that Hamilton sees it, John Jay sees it, these kinds of Federalists, precisely because they're much more contemptuous of poor people in general. They're contemptuous of poor whites and less sympathetic towards their claims. Whereas Jefferson, who's more sympathetic towards poor whites, is less sympathetic towards Native American claims. So what that means in effect is that the more elitist you are in the early republic, the more maybe the less racist you are. I mean, I know there's not a direct correlation, but it often maps out that way. And the more sympathetic you are to Native American land claims. And so people who we like for their democracy, we dislike for their racism. And vice versa. People who we dislike for their elitism, we like for their anti-racism or their early, at least, reluctance to, their principled stands on abolition. And so, Hamilton today has become really this great hero, but we do that we make him into this hero by forgetting his deep elitism and his deep preference for rigging the economic game in favor of rich people.
Yeah.
So, I mean, maybe he's a kind of like, ideal representative of the kind of multicultural neoliberalism we have, right? Of Obama's America, let's say.
Or perhaps a cautionary tale about trying to turn history into a morality tale. I don't know.
Yes, I mean, that's right.
That's okay. Now, I assigned a couple chapters of your book, When the United States Spoke French, to one class, and I was surprised by how horrified some of the students were by that whole episode with the bloodhounds. I mean, very, very. I mean, I have a lot of Caribbean students in my classes, and they had never heard about this. And in fact, I have heard about it before in passing, a few times in various books and stuff like that, but I've never heard it described in quite the detail that you go into. I mean, actually, that book I mentioned before, Charles Mann's book, 1493, he talks about that incident as well, and he talks about how it went wrong for various reasons because, the bloodhounds were not effectively very racist. So they started eating like white people and stuff like that as well. But can you sort of just describe how something that horrific, I mean, it's one of the really deeply, it's disgusting and disturbing that it happened, but it's also one thing you point out, which nobody else has pointed out to the best of my knowledge, is that there was a huge appetite to hear all the gory details about this on the part of the public, right? This was newspapers, just they couldn't get enough of it, right? So can you just sort of describe what happened and what?
I mean, so this is all in the context of the Haitian Revolution, the late stages of the Haitian Revolution, and in Napoleon's decision, which we've talked about, to try to reconquer the island and put the former slaves back into slavery and take direct control over the French colony. And I mean, the Haitian Revolution has, part of the difficulty of it's a very complicated event in and of itself, or series of events, or however you want to talk about it. And it has very high levels of violence. Now, every revolution has violence, I think. And so how do we talk about violence? And it's a very complicated historical issue when you're thinking about this. It's a moral issue, really, because it has deep implications. If we talk about the American Revolution, by minimizing the level of violence that happens in the American Revolution, we understand it as this sort of reasoned, enlightened movement towards liberty. And that reinforces all the kind of claims that we want to make, that many people want to make about the United States, and it's the justice with which those claims are founded, and the justice of the ultimate outcome, and the legitimacy of the American Republic. If you emphasize violence more, it makes it seem more barbaric, right? So there's a greater. There probably are. I mean, if you measure the actual levels of dead people, there are more dead people in the French Revolution than there are in the American Revolution, particularly if you count the Napoleonic Wars. In fact, those largely by massively outweigh the number of corpses in North America. So and that becomes part of the way we understand. There's a kind of narrative of violence in the French Revolution, which is used to discredit the Jacobins in particular. Right? These are the people who go around executing their enemies. which is partly true, but also it's a way of undermining the claims that the political claims that they're making. And this is even more true in the Haitian Revolution, where many people really emphasize the violence, and it is an unbelievably violent event. But dwelling on the violence and dwelling on the goriness of it and on the savagery of the violence, let's use that term, is a way of discrediting the Haitian Revolution as something that's very different from the American Revolution, right? The Haitian Revolution is this just this outburst of frenzied violence, senseless. It's not reasoned, and therefore it doesn't make the same claims it doesn't make the same political claims. It doesn't have the same political valence, and in fact, it can be used as an example of why it's dangerous to begin extending rights or to begin talking about rights for Black people or equality for Black people, because here's where it ends up. It ends up in this outburst of savage violence. And so emphasizing the violence of the Haitian Revolution becomes a way of discrediting the movement itself and of discrediting racial equality and discrediting independent states for Black people. So that's part of the reason that this is such a fraught topic, I think, and it's part of the reason that it's very, it's difficult to talk about these things in ways that don't have immediate political implications and that make people uncomfortable to talk about. All that said, there was a shocking amount of violence in the Haitian Revolution, and it's a depressing and painful thing to look at. And part of the reason it's so violent is precisely because whites are able to see Black people as subhuman, and so they have fewer compunctions about murdering them than they do about white people. So
I kept thinking, and I wrote this in my copy of your book. I kept writing in the on the margins, I said, what if scenarios, right? I thought if somehow the British were mobilizing a whole bunch of bloodhounds and going to use them as a tool to fight against the revolutionaries in the American Revolution, I imagine that if they were doing something like that, that would have massively turned the people of Britain against the government and for the revolutionaries. It would have been massively terrible PR, right, for them, right? Likewise, if you think about it in the Spanish context, if they were organizing to put together a couple hundred bloodhounds to help them in the sort of the conquest of Mexico or something like that, that's the kind of thing that would have massively turned Spanish public opinion against the crown and things like that. They did do a lot. They did a lot of violent stuff, but this is the kind of things that went back.
That was used to discredit Spanish imperialism in the Americas.
So why is it that this is what's interesting to me, that you have this thing that happens, and rather than discrediting the people that are doing it, it's something that sells a lot of newspapers and it's quite popular.
Yeah, well, I think it does discredit the French side, in the eyes of many people. I think that's part of the reason. Certainly within there's a long tradition within Haitian historiography of writing about this very clearly, and so there's no doubt that from a Haitian perspective, this discredits the legitimacy of the French. Without a doubt. For American audiences, for Anglo-American audiences, it's a little more complicated, right? Because on the one hand, the French are the enemy. Mm-hmm. So I think there's some appetite for seeing stories of French savagery in Saint-Domingue. But on the other hand, very few white people, or some, but very few, who are willing to see the legitimacy of the Haitian movement. So both sides, it kind of accomplishes both ends among Anglo-Americans, I think. That is to say, it highlights the savagery of the French and Napoleon, but it also highlights the savagery of former enslaved people who are fighting for their freedom. It makes them out to be not fighting for freedom, but just, as I was saying, there's this frenzied outburst of violence. So dwelling on the violence, on the other, and the final thing is there's always a kind of sort of pornographic appetite for these stories of violence. We still have this today. Mm-hmm. Half the movies that come out are just, have plenty of violence in them, right? Because people on some level like to see violence. But that's a very simplistic claim. So, but, in the political context of the 1790s and early 1800s, emphasizing the kind of the savagery of both sides, the savagery of this war can discredit both the French and the Haitians, thus, serving American ends very, very well, and British ends very well. So I think, it fits well in this kind of storyline. And you can look back on the Haitian Revolution, and it becomes, as I say, like later, it becomes really easy to discredit the whole thing. This was so violent that this should never again be attempted. And pro-slavery, people who want to justify the legitimacy of slavery will often, and who are anti-abolitionist, will often point to Saint-Domingue as the example of what happens when you start extending rights to black people. It will end in this total morass of violence. And bloodshed, and that's why you shouldn't do these things.
This is why you've got the wolf by the ears, right? You have to
and this is why it's very dangerous to start talking about abolition, and it's very dangerous to start putting protections on passing laws, say, against protecting slaves in whatever way, or talking about the ending of the slave trade or the beginning of some movement towards gradual abolition. I mean, all these things are dangerous for people who are opposed to abolition, and so the Haitian Revolution can be used. I mean, it's one of these things. It can be used as the example for people who are anti-abolition, and then it's of course used by people who are pro-abolition, right, as a great symbol of the justice of the abolitionist cause, right, of the humanity of black people. So it serves both purposes in different hands, and it becomes a very powerful symbol in every respect.
Well, it's sort of the inevitable question in 2018 as an American historian. How do you make sense of the Trump? I mean, how do you sort of make sense of what's going on in the United States right now? I mean, you have this sort of long perspective, right? Deep knowledge of the Republic. How did it get to this point? I mean, do you think the founding fathers anticipated a Donald Trump, or do you think they prepared adequately for somebody like this, or what do you think?
I mean, okay, so yes and no. I mean, they certainly couldn't have predicted a Donald Trump, right? Like a person who comes out of reality television, the sort of culture of celebrity. This is nothing that anybody would have imagined in the 1780s. But on the other hand, the idea of a sort of despot coming up, of somebody with very authoritarian instincts, and a willingness to run roughshod over law, and the judiciary, other branches of government. I mean, all these things are very much what the framers of the Constitution had in mind when they put in place this whole system of checks and balances. So yes and no. I mean, people, a big part of the Constitution is to try to prevent the rise of a Donald Trump. Now, of course, everything depends on what your perspective of Donald Trump is, right?
Yeah.
But from my perspective, there's an awful lot of attempts to try to discredit this. And in many ways, this is a kind of test of our constitutional system, isn't it? I think it completely failed in terms of his election. I mean, the purpose of the Electoral College, as it was set up, it was meant to be this sort of Congress of wise and virtuous men who would gather together to make sure that the people who couldn't really be trusted didn't elect a despot, and they would be able to elect somebody with sort of greater wisdom and virtue. The Electoral College has been sort of mangled over the years, but clearly it didn't serve that purpose. In fact, it served the exact opposite purpose. It's thanks to the Electoral College and the ways in which it calculates votes that we ended up with Donald Trump. So that failed on the terms of the founders. And there's an awful lot of things that they put in place that have been withered away. I mean, I often am sort of amused by the by claims to sort of originalism among people with those who make those arguments, because particularly when it comes to a very literal reading of the Second Amendment, I mean, I think there's all kinds of reasons for thinking that the people who wrote the Constitution didn't have assault weapons in mind when they were thinking about the Second Amendment, the right to bear arms. But today, if you're very literal, you say, well, that's a constitutional protection, fine. But what the Constitution also says is that only Congress can declare war. So why do we not have as literal a reading of that clause as we do of the Second Amendment? And today, it's taken virtually for granted that the president can, as he recently did in Syria, and as Obama did before him on many occasions, George Bush did, as every president basically since Roosevelt has done, can can go to war without Congress's without a vote for war. Now, people say, well, there's a War Powers Act and there's authorization to use violence, but none of these is a declaration of war. So if you are a very literal, an originalist reading the Constitution, why don't you find that? So there's all kinds of ways in which the Constitution was set up. The executive power today is vastly greater than it was in. You referred to Gore Vidal. I mean, he was somebody who made this argument over and over again, right?
Yeah.
Executive power is so much greater than it was under the Constitution. I mean, than it was envisioned by the people who wrote the Constitution, and that seems to bother relatively few people, including and in particular, it doesn't seem to bother whatsoever those who have a very literalist reading of the Constitution, originalist reading of the Constitution. So from my perspective as somebody who dwells in the late 18th and early 19th century, there's a lot of transformation at work, a lot of danger at work. And on the other hand, you can take an opposite perspective and say, this is a kind of test of the Constitution. I mean, there are many checks and balances. And in fact, Donald Trump has been repeatedly thwarted by these checks and balances. He had his original sort of ban on immigration of people from certain countries was blocked immediately, and then has repeatedly been blocked. And many of the things that Trump has tried to put in place have been blocked by judges. And his attempts to, make the FBI into his kind of personal police force have really quite backfired on him, haven't they? I mean, he's got the opposite sort of happening, where the FBI is investigating him in all kinds of ways. So, and in many ways, that reflects the strength of the kind of constitutional system, doesn't it? But in interesting ways, what people talk about all the time today is the kind of norms, right? Now, norms aren't part of the Constitution. I mean, that wasn't, in fact, part of the reason it was written the way it was because the framers didn't have very much confidence in norms, did they? They thought that we needed very sort of a mechanized system of checks and balances to prevent these kinds of things from happening. So, and today we have the mechanics are less strong, as I was saying earlier, and the faith in the norms is stronger. And and maybe this will be ultimately to the good, in the sense that maybe we'll stop thinking, okay, we just need to have norms, so we can allow the president to the power to just go to war whenever he pleases, or she, and we'll just trust in the norms that have traditionally refrained, prevented people from taking that too far. Well, maybe we should stop doing that. And maybe Trump is a good reason why we should stop doing that. Maybe we'll start putting into place some greater legal mechanisms to restrain executive power, which, from my perspective, this is a political statement, not a historical one. But from my perspective,
it's interesting. The argument you're making is very similar to David Frum, of Axis of Evil fame. David Frum's new book, Trumpocracy. There's this emerging sort of genre. I call it sort of anti-Trump lit, right? But his contribution to anti-Trump lit was Trumpocracy, right? And the last, and he's of course one of the first never Trumpers in the Republican Party. Yeah, Canadian guy originally, and he's been very, very consistent in his criticism of Trump from the beginning. And in the last chapter of his book of Trumpocracy, he says a lot of the same things you just said. He said, actually, there's a lot of good things that may come of this. And he says, it may force us to realize that we've been looking the other way while the executive branch has been arrogating all sorts of authority to itself for decades. And maybe having somebody who so flagrantly makes clear what this can lead to will be a good thing. It'll actually cause us to rein this back and put in special firewalls. And he makes a lot of comparisons to Watergate, right? That, I mean, Nixon was using, as you put it, the FBI as his private sort of police force, as his thugs to do his dirty work for him. And after that, all these various firewalls were put in place so that could not happen again. And that's exactly what Trump doesn't seem to realize when he calls up the head of the FBI and says, I want you to kiss the ring and give me loyalty. And he's like, no, I don't think so. Right. It's it could be a good thing.
It could be. I will say that I would have more, I'd be more persuaded by voices like David Frum, right?
Yeah.
If it wasn't such a recent conversion, I mean, these are the very guys who were making claims to unitary executives under George W. Bush, and who were, very happy to go along with executive power to torture and all kinds of things, and who had very little respect. I mean, let's not forget that George W. Fired a whole set of prosecutors, and I mean, there were all kinds of ways in which the George W. Bush administration laid the groundwork for what Donald Trump is doing now, and many of the arguments, and in fact, as we see from Bolton, for instance, many of the same people who cut their teeth, many of the same people who cut their teeth in the Bush administration are back in and advancing the very same claims to executive power, so that Trump is making. So, I will. I suppose I'm happy to have Frum as an ally, but I it's one of the strange things about American politics is that people who were wrong in the past, when they say things that seem right now, they have more credibility and authority than people who were right in the past. So people who are complaining about Bush's executive power somehow have less of a mouthpiece, less of a what's the megaphone today than people who were wrong about Bush's executive. I mean, people who were on Bush's side and are now opposed to Trump somehow have more credibility than people who were not on Bush's side and are now opposed to Trump. And it's a weird element of American politics.
It is very weird, and the similarity of personnel is fascinating. That's one of the reasons why I actually think Comey's new book, which just came out, I read it last week. Right away I was feverishly reading through it. But his book is fascinating for exactly that reason, because he is somebody who's had a lot of conflictual interactions with different administrations. So he had run-ins with the Obama administration, with the Bush. He was actually at the forefront of fighting them on the torture issue.
Yeah, there was that famous bedside scene right in the hospital when Ashcroft was.
Yeah, that's
what made him head of the FBI, isn't it?
Yeah, that was very, very shocking. But also, there's a couple other scenes in his book where he's sitting there with Dick Cheney, and Dick Cheney looks him right in the eyes and says, thousands of people are going to die because of you, because of what you're doing right now. Because he was saying, you need to stop this torture thing right away. I'm not going to go along with this. This is so it's interesting reading from his perspective, because people are kind of angry at him on all sides, and I understand why. He kind of deserves it, but he has been consistent. He's again and again in his career, he's been this sort of uptight Boy Scout who is just going to do what he thinks is right, regardless of he's going to prosecute Martha Stewart, even though everybody is going to hate him for doing it, because he said, why should she get a pass just because she's famous and wealthy? And why should, and he's done this again and again and again. So he kind of I think Trump has kind of met his match with this guy, because this guy is just, he's willing to burn down the whole house, for what he thinks is right,
Yeah, he has great faith in his righteousness, doesn't he?
Yeah.
I think
it's annoying. It's he reminds me of exactly, Aristotle says virtue taken too far becomes vice. I mean, he just reeks of virtue taken too far.
The one thing I'll say about when it comes to torture too, though, if we're going to get on the political line of conversation, is that I think we shouldn't let Obama off the hook either. When Obama came into office, this was in my mind one of the great moral issues at stake in the election of 2008. Was what kind of referendum are we going to make on this question of should the United States torture when it's at war, or at least in the name of war? And Obama, one of the reasons he beat Hillary in the primary was that he was very clear that torture was wrong. I mean, he never
going to close Guantanamo.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And then when he came to office, he immediately changed his tune and said, "We can't look back. We have to look forward." And never mind. I mean, in my ideal world, we would have done investigations and prosecution of people who'd broken the law, and everybody from the person who actually did the torture to the people who authorized it, all the way up to the office of the president in the White House or the vice president or wherever it was coming from, would have been put on trial and convicted if they'd broken the law. Now, I realize that's politically a little unrealistic. But at the very least, there could have been a greater transparency. There could have been some truth commission that went, and the reports, the Senate did this, huge investigation, and then it was all kept very hush-hush. Very few pieces of it were released. So there was never a really public reckoning with what the United States had done during the Bush administration. And in the name of looking forward, we never did that. And Obama chose not to do that. And I think today that can be seen as a huge mistake in the sense that all these people are back in, and we're about, he's appointed, and Senate will probably confirm this person who was one of the people leading the charge, who should, if not have been convicted, at the very least. No, the woman, I forgot her name.
Gina Haspel.
Is that her name?
Yeah,
Haspel.
Yeah.
At the very least, she should have been, testifying publicly in front of Congress and a truth commission. She should have been drummed out of that profession. And instead she's going to be leading it. So this is what happens when you don't reckon with the past, right? This is easy for a historian to say, but you end up with people who continue these policies. So again, to go back to David Frum, sorry.
It's hard for you to take his word at it. Yeah. But as you point out in your book, right, sometimes people start off in one place and end up in a very, very different place. And Frum actually does express regret for some of the things that he did and said, and he's definitely not sort of unapologetic about what happened. I think he definitely sees that to some extent he had a hand in creating the problems that we're dealing with right now.
Yeah,
and
well, that's good. And he's Canadian.
Yeah, and he's Canadian. Yeah. Well, the last question I want to ask you, and we'll close with that, is what are you working on right now? What is the next book? What are you excited about right now?
So
besides your two little girls, how old are they again?
7 months and 2 years and 3 months, I think.
Wow. So you're busy. Okay.
Yes.
Well, when you're not running after kids,
mostly
changing diapers,
getting up at night.
Yeah.
So I have a couple of sort of projects I'm working on. The most immediate one that I'm working on right now, which I need to get done this summer, is I've signed on to a textbook team. So I've joined a existing textbook. One of the authors retired, and so I'm replacing her on her chapters on leading up to the American Revolution through up to Jackson, basically. And we're working on the 8th edition of this textbook, and it's actually been tremendously fun to work on this so far. Because
which one?
It's called The American Promise.
Oh yeah. Okay. I don't know if you remember, but when we were in grad school, one of the ways I made money was I was hired by this company, and I reviewed all of the top 20 American history textbooks on the market. It paid really, really well. It was but I would read the whole textbook and then review them. And that one was one of the best. I can't remember if I gave it. I think it was my number 2 or 3 in the rankings. But I think the way you write is exactly what is needed for American history. Something that's very vivid, very kind of grabs the student and gets them interested without losing kind of the thread of the analysis. So I guess you're writing the early Republican chapters?
Yeah, writing from the 7 years. It starts the first chapter I'm taking is the 7 Years War and the aftermath, and then going all the way to Jackson, basically. And I think once the age of Jackson begins, it moves on to someone else's.
Wow. Okay.
And
that's exciting.
It's fun. It's been really fun. And it's interesting that you say that about writing, because the writing style is one that I've been thinking about, and it's particularly one because I'm inheriting someone else's chapters, and these are great chapters. It's a great textbook, as you say. Yeah. It's a really terrific, very, very good. And so how do you make something that's really good? How do you avoid revising it to make it worse, which is obviously a danger. And so I've been trying to put a little bit more of my own voice in there. But one of the things that makes this a really great textbook is that it has a lot of life in it. It has a lot of characters in it, and there's a lot of voices from people in the past. That's how they sort of understand themselves within this big, competitive textbook market. Trying to strike some balance between having an individual voice and also being able to take a very synthetic, perspective from the stratosphere on American history. You want to be able to talk about. You want to be comprehensive without giving up some kind of narrative line, without losing entirely the agency of individual people. And it's a big challenge. And it's fun to sort of work on and think about, actually. Yeah.
How do you deal with, 'cause it's going back 20 years here, but I remember that one of the things that I identified when I was doing this whole review was that the single author works, like the textbooks, the single author textbooks, even though they would have, all sorts of various defaults, which were usually a function of the fact that the historian in question was just, not very strong on this issue or this issue. But the defects I found were almost always vastly sort of outweighed by the benefits of having a single voice, which is it's very powerful for a student reading it. And I found that the multi-author works, even when they were very, very well done, it was incredibly jarring to be reading, and it's like one voice, and then boom, it's a completely different voice, and it often like kills the flow. So how do you deal with that in The American Promise, like trying to smooth that out?
Yeah.
Or do you just not deal with it?
Well, no, it's a really good question. The single author, so the best-selling textbook in the market right now is Eric Foner's Give Me Liberty, I think it's called. And it comes out of his now actually having, like, I don't know whether, so he wrote this book called The Story of American Freedom.
I remember, yeah.
I don't know whether whether that book came out of the textbook or whether the textbook came out of that book.
The textbook came out of the book,
but
because I remember I talked to him about this, the textbook came out of the book, and the idea was to basically expand the book into a textbook. But when he started doing it, he realized it wasn't going to work, and so he scrapped the book and just started from scratch and wrote the textbook. Right?
I see. He didn't really turn it into, but
the plan was originally
was original. So whether he wrote that Story of American Freedom with the textbook in the back of his mind or not, I don't know. It's interesting. Yeah. Anyway, but the single author book clearly has its appeal, right? Because this is the one that's the best selling.
Yep.
And it is, you have a perspective, you have a stronger sort of narrative through line in the book, and you're allowed, he makes it possible to hitch a lot of things around this sort of expansion of, and there's a real narrative line, as I say in there. It's not just because there's a common theme, but also because, you can see moments where freedom expands, and then you can see it, there's setbacks, and you can see it moving forward. And so that's its real strength, I think, as well as its vivid writing.
Vivid? I don't know. I don't.
You don't find it?
I think it's a great textbook, but I don't think nobody's ever accused Eric Foner of being a great writer.
Really?
So,
I think he's a good writer.
I think he's a very good thinker, and he thinks in a sort of logical and organized way, and he's a great historian. I just don't think he's but actually, I think that only further reinforces the point I'm making. Like, even though he's not the best writer in the world, it's the number one textbook, because that's how nice it is to have a single voice telling the story. That even if the voice is off tune, and often it still is really powerful. So
it's a huge market, and what's interesting, not everybody wants the same things, obviously, and so many people find many people find that to be a great attraction to the book, because the students like it, but some people clearly find that don't want that in the classroom, because they want something that's going to be a little more, I don't know if neutral is the right word, but that's going to have a different kind of voice, or maybe less of a strong voice, and something that they can then play off against in the classroom. Many people clearly want that, and so that's, I don't think it's about distinguishing it, but to come back to the question you were asking at first, how do you manage that? It's I don't really know. So I've been thinking about this as I've been working on starting these revisions, and one of the things that I noticed, which is kind of interesting, is that we get a whole set of reviews. There's like 30 reviews that come back from different people who use the book in their classroom. Some of them who use this book, others who use other books, and they comment on the textbook, and they're really incisive reviews, actually. And these are people who are working in really interesting ways in the classroom. We're obviously very dedicated to the kinds of things they're doing. But one of the things what I didn't see in the reviews, and somebody pointed this out in the meeting that we had, is that many of them talked about kind of the downsides of writing a textbook by committee. But there isn't a sense, or at least not expressed, that actually different people are sole authors of the different chapters, right? That actually each chapter has its own solo author. It's not actually written by committee. So it's not that we're all working on all the chapters together. But they seem to think that that's the case, which suggests on the one hand that they do a pretty good job of integrating the chapters among the different authors, and it's one of the things to think about as I'm revising, whether I want to change that too much. And also that, that somehow there is this kind of, or there seems to be, if not a voice from nowhere, at least a voice that's not recognizable as an individualized kind of voice.
Or those reviewers are just not very good readers.
They're pretty good readers, actually. No, they are. And maybe they don't.
Comment,
maybe they just assume.
Clear when you're reading the chapters of a multi-author, it's pretty clear that we've changed gears and it's another voice, and it's one voice for that chapter.
Well, they do a lot of things to try to keep them together, right? So there's always the sort of vivid anecdote that starts out the chapter, and then the individual who's used to kind of weave through the chapter. So there are certain kind of, and then there's the analyzing viewpoints and analyzing primary sources and other kinds of things. So there are things that are done to try to maintain a consistency throughout the book, and in those, and also the distinction between the voice in those sort of separate features and the voice in the actual textbook they're different enough from each other to keep things. So anyway, but yeah, I mean, there are pluses and minuses to having a strong voice, and it's definitely something to think about in the textbook
I remember
world.
the top. Once again, it's been a while, but I remember the top grades for extra material, like sort of quizzes and essay topics and things like that. American Promise was number one on that. I remember it was just unbelievable. In an environment where, and we can talk about how evil this is, but where a lot of these American History 101 classes are being taught by part-timers, by graduate students, by people who are very busy, don't have a lot of time, maybe don't even have enough knowledge to be teaching the class. If you get a textbook like that, it's almost like a drone. I mean, it's almost like self-guiding class. Like it gives you just everything. It just makes sure. I mean, the extra materials you get as a teacher for the now it sounds like we're doing an ad for the American Promise. But no, it actually is like a really fantastic.
The publisher's going to be really happy with this.
Yeah.
That's been actually, and that's the other thing. So I've been learning a lot from this process, really, and working on those kind of pedagogical features, which are a huge part of the textbook, right? It's not just the narrative, and in certain ways, those are more important than the narrative itself, because that's what a lot of people want to be able to have in the classroom. And so thinking about the pedagogy behind this, and each time, I'm sort of revising a paragraph or a section, I'm thinking, okay, what are the essential questions at work here? And how do you want to develop these kinds of historical, the skills of sort of thinking historically, right? So how do you want to pose questions that force students to think about cause and effect, and that force students to think about relationships and about how different people can have different viewpoints on the same event, and those have very different meanings. And so all of these things, thinking really hard pedagogically and going, paragraph, sentence by sentence through the book and thinking in those ways and through different periods has been really a terrific exercise for me, and hopefully it'll make me a better teacher too. But it's true that it's a really important way to be thinking. And it also helps you kind of think about what it is that I want to expand and what do I want to remove here, because one of the challenges is you have to revise without adding any words. So to the total word count, that is to say. So it's
so you inherit these chapters and you don't just like burn them to the ground and
no.
write them fresh. You revise them.
Yeah.
Okay.
So over time, I mean, if I were to stick with this for multiple editions, over time, more of the prose would end up being mine. And it's sort of like I was thinking about. There's the old thing about
stone soup.
What's that?
The stone soup, the old like Yiddish proverb of like. Oh, anyway, it's a great story where things get replaced until it's a completely new thing, right? So
there's this thing. No, I was thinking about the grandfather's axe or whatever it is. Like replace the handle 3 times and the head twice, but it's still my favorite axe.
So, are you working on anything else other than the textbook project right now?
I have I'm co-authoring a little book. I hope it was supposed to be an article at first, and it's turned into a little book with Eric Hinderaker, who's historian, Native American historian at the University of Utah, and he and I are writing on Frederick Jackson Turner.
Oh wow!
We both got interested in Turner separately, but we've joined forces to think about Turner. I mean, I think one of the objectives is to kind of move beyond the frontier thesis, which is what most people sort of associate Turner with, the essay on the significance of the frontier, and think about other work that he was doing, and think more broadly actually about his sort of historical world, and the kind of the whole intellectual milieu in which he's working, and kind of try to engage that with historians today. So one of the things I've been working on, the chapter that I'm working on right now, is thinking about is on what he called physiography, which was a whole kind of discipline. I mean, it's an early form of geography, really. And he was really interested in geography and really interested in the relations between the natural world and the human society. And so there's ways in which this can be seen as a kind of early environmental history. And so thinking harder about ways in which we come out of these older old bodies of scholarship today, and about how we can dialogue with that more interestingly, make that part of the conversation that we have. Part of the impulse, I think, is a general...
That actually rings true to me. I'd never thought about that before, but Turner does sound often like, guns, germs, and steel, or like he sounds like one of those geographers that have these big sweeping theses about like how environment, you're almost like Charles Mann actually as well.
He's really interested. And he knows a lot actually about, trees and soils and mountain ranges and all kinds of stuff. It's amazing. And he's really, he's interested in this stuff and he thinks deeply about it. And, and in many ways, in certain ways, he can be seen as a Native American historian. It's provocative to say that. Yeah. In other ways, he can be seen as a kind of transnational historian. So there's all kinds of ways in which the things that we're interested in today, were also being practiced in very different ways back then. It's not to sort of rehabilitate Turner at all, but it's to sort of think about how to sort of think with him, if you want to think about that. One of my perpetual complaints about historians is that we're very quick to kind of sort of assert our own superiority relative to the historiography that came before us. So we're always bashing some some past historian in the beginning of a book. It's a dialectical way of thinking and it's useful, but at the same time it's often very wrong actually, and it's I think more productive to have those people as part of our conversation instead of just kind of bash them, because our ideas don't come out of nowhere. They come out of these old traditions, long traditions of deep reflection.
Well, I'm very glad to have had you as part of this conversation, the Likeville conversation. So thank you very much for coming today, and I look forward to reading that book when you're done with it.
Thanks for having me, John.
Okay.